This is going to be a short video on the difference between production and productivity. As I said, we'll be looking at the difference between production and productivity, and we'll be looking at some of the benefits of increased productivity for workers, firms, and the wider economy. To illustrate the difference between production and productivity, let's take the example of two firms producing shoes, Firm A and Firm B. Both Firm A and Firm B produce 1 million shoes per year. Regardless of the inputs these firms use, they both churn out 1 million shoes every year to sell at supermarkets across the country. In this regard, these firms look pretty similar. However, when we look at the inputs both firms use, we get an entirely different picture. Firm A decides not to invest in machinery to manufacture the shoes, but instead relies on a labor-intensive production process, relying on Vietnamese workers to sew the fabric together, to glue the soles in, and to thread the shoelaces in. Firm B, on the other hand, relies on a capital-intensive production process. It decides to automate the production process as much as possible, having tens of machines taking on the same tasks that the workers do in Firm A. The result? Although both firms produce the same quantity of shoes at the end of the year, Firm A does it with 200 workers, but Firm B does it with only 30 machines. Herein lies the key difference between production and productivity. Production refers to the value of output of goods and services. In other words, the scale at which resource inputs are converted into outputs of finished and semi-finished goods. Productivity, on the other hand, is the efficiency of the production process. It has many measures depending on what we're trying to measure. For example, productivity could be measured as output per acre if we're trying to measure the productivity of land. If we're trying to measure labor productivity, it can be measured in output per hour per worker. Or if we're trying to measure the productivity of capital, it could simply be measured in output per hour. Looking back to the previous example where we had two firms producing shoes, we see that although the scale of production for both firms is the same, they're both producing 1 million shoes every year, Firm B, in deciding to adopt a capital-intensive production process, was much more productive in producing those shoes. That was only an example, but it illustrates this key difference. In reality, you may have firms on a much larger scale with a more diverse allocation of factors of production. So now we've outlined the key difference between production and productivity, let's now look at the benefits of having higher productivity. Firstly, higher profit levels. The more productive a firm is, the lower resource inputs it requires to produce a certain level of outputs. Evidently, this is good for profit levels. If a firm is able to increase its productivity, it may be able to cut costs by laying off some workers or switching off some machines, for example, all whilst not sacrificing the quantity of goods being produced. Profit equals total revenue minus total costs. So a fall in total costs, whilst revenue remains the same, will lead to higher profit levels. These profits could be reinvested back into the firm in research and development projects to further productivity or expand product lines in the future. These profits could also be paid out to investors in the form of dividends. This makes the firm more attractive to investors, making it easier to find investment should the need arise. Secondly, higher wages. Higher labor productivity could also be beneficial for workers. If a worker becomes more productive, in other words, produces more goods and services in a given period than before, then that worker becomes more valuable to a firm. Workers in this case may be able to demand higher wages to account for this. Thirdly, higher productivity could lead to lower prices for consumers and in turn increase domestic and international competitiveness. So another way in which firms can use the extra profits they receive from higher productivity is through subsidizing lower prices for consumers. By taking a slight hit to their profit margins, the firm may be able to offer their goods or services at a lower cost to consumers, increasing their competitiveness in both domestic and international markets. This could be very effective in allowing firms to increase their market share in the near future. Lastly, here's an impact of higher productivity on the wider economy and on the environment. Namely, higher productivity could lead to a lower negative impact on the environment. If a firm adopts more productive production techniques that minimize wastage and lower required inputs, this then places less strain on the environment, as resources no longer need to be depleted as quickly as before. This could ensure that materials, especially non-renewable ones such as coal, oil, natural gas, and even metals found in the earth such as copper and gold, are sustainably used, making them available for future generations as well. Here's a news article relating to this topic. Tesla underproducing Model 3, too much automation? This is a really interesting article that really has to do with this idea of production and productivity and how capital-intensive and labor-intensive production processes relate to them. You'll also see this extension question on footloose capitalism. What's footloose capitalism, I hear you ask? You may be wondering because you'll be hard-pressed to find it in your textbook in this section. I mention this because you might recall I referred to Vietnamese workers being hired by firm A to produce shoes. I'm not going to give away any more, but if you search the term in Google, you'll find loads of explanations and examples, including many relating to how Vietnam has benefited from footloose capitalism. Thank you very much for listening.